Welcome to the Awaken Your Potential podcast, a series of conscious discussions on topics of awakening, healing, purification, ascension, and personal transformation. Please do enjoy.
My flow into how I messaged you is, one thing I realized is I kind of go through these natural ebbs and flows and these cycles of when the traditional kind of non-dual teachings, and I mean it's always there naturally, but sometimes I just feel more called to directly, I don't know, contemplate it, or it's kind of funny to even describe how that works, but I found myself listening to some Rupert Spira lately, and it's also kind of compounded by the fact that obviously where I am, and probably where anybody is, if you're in the communities, there's all these spiritual people around, and they're always talking about these random things that they seem to put a lot of importance on. Not necessarily random things, but you know what I mean. Like, different people give different amounts of importance to different things, and you're around people who involve themselves in different realms of work. People are talking about how they can connect to all these different beings, and then people, you go to a land with someone, and then they'll talk about the ancestors of that land, and essentially all this different type of phenomena. And I noticed this confusion in my mind, and these kind of rigid edges in my mind of not knowing how to interpret accurately all of these different perspectives and all these things, because a lot of the time I'm kind of frustrated. I'm kind of yeah, that's cool, but I don't think that's as important as you. And then I start thinking well, maybe I'm really selling myself short. Maybe there's something I'm really not getting here. Maybe this is worthy of my time. Or so anyways, I say all that to say it brought me to some Rupert Spira, and I was just for a couple of days there, just authentically having a great little non-dual experience.
It's always so comforting. So many of those, I remember so many hours spent whether Rupert Spira or back in the day with Muji or some shit, you know what I mean? And you're oh yeah. But I can imagine it's different now, obviously after doing Rasa and just where you're at, yeah, it's more of just this subtle reminder where you're oh yeah, of course.
Yeah,
so clear.
Sometimes you can really get into experience, and you just it clouds the sun or whatever, right? That's the metaphor they always use. And then the clouds go away, and you're oh right, yeah, none of that really who I am. But there's, I guess, a good place to start, if we're gonna talk about all this stuff, is in your own words, or maybe in your own, I know what we're talking about is beyond experience and all that anyway, but in your own experience, what would you define from this point in your life as this whole topic or concept of the absolute realization or awareness, being aware of itself? Or what is that journey within yourself, if you're going to sit and meditate, or maybe it's just ever present throughout your day at this point? What is that like for you, or how would you describe that to someone?
Yeah, that's a juicy one. Well, I actually I led a meditation the other day for the peace room on the Wednesday, and I think I was mentioning to you a couple of days ago, when we were talking about it on Telegram, and I was okay, I did this really advanced meditation with peace room, and I don't know how many people actually got it, but it was just so crystal clear, because I usually just teach. The only meditation I generally teach is, sometimes some cellular breathing, or maybe some kind of KS style, activation or something. But most of the time it's traditional self-inquiry, moving to the source of being. And then lately it's been much more about feeling states, igniting compassion or love or a sense of peace. Because I look at them as an 8-ball, when you shake an 8-ball and it's it's just a ball on the inside. So it's just a million faces of the same ball, So like peace, joy, love, like they're all coming from the same place, but I kind of just like use that spin off depending on like the frequency of the day um, or whatever I'm feeling. But on Wednesday this week when we did the meditation, and it's happened a couple times before, but it was so clear. It was like, okay, we think we're, because much of the journey of self-inquiry is about like awareness, like we're becoming aware of something, we're conscious, we're witnessing thoughts, feelings, sensations, all the movement of phenomena, all these experiences coming and going, whatever. But in reality, when you actually look at it, like when you actually come to like move to that space of awareness, there isn't actually any awareness happening, because who is aware, you know what I mean? Like it's like there's no human action of being aware or witnessing that so-called consciousness or this source is doing. That's not what's happening. What's happening is there's a seemingly something that seems like an arising, that when you actually come to that level of realization, you see that there isn't really even an arising. It's just source revealing itself in a new form, and then endlessly revealing itself in endlessly new form. So the example I gave was like the ocean. Like you have the ocean and then you have a wave. The wave isn't separate from the ocean. So likewise, it's not like there's awareness and then awareness is being aware of something, like a thought or a feeling or a sensation or a chakra or whatever. What's happening is just there's a movement of source, and source is already there. Like there's no object subject, everything is kind of like collapsed. So from that sense, if there's no like two dual things or separation in any form, then there's nothing that actually could like define what that single thing is, because there's no boundary. You know what I mean? Like there's no boundary enough. Thus, if there's no boundary, then there's nothing to compare it to. So that is like that absolute source that is so fundamental to everything, that you can't touch it or see it or feel it. Like there's nothing that could possibly like grab a hold of that. But yet it's actually so real. Like it's so clear, especially like going in that meditation, which like happens a lot of often these days. But I still find myself having to like go into it at times. um but it's just so clear, like everything is just the same source, everything is made and manifested from the same source. So like if that's the case, then there's literally like there's nothing to even conceive of anything. Like it's just like everything you see is just this same source manifesting itself. And then like that's what it was like 4 years ago when Rasa ended, and like I came to that clarity, and I'm like, oh yeah, like it does make sense. But then there was many waves of integration that came after that, where it was just like further coming into the heart. That's what I felt, like a deep compassion. Like I was telling you a couple of weeks ago, where like go to the grocery store and I'm just like looking at everyone. I'm like, oh, everyone's just fucking source, and like if they're just doing the best they can and fucking love everyone. You know what I mean? Because you can't like from that vantage point, the only thing could be that like love and compassion, even for like the greatest of some demon, or like the powers that be, or I don't know, all the shit going on in this universe. Like everything is just still conceived as that, because it couldn't be anything else but that, right? So that like that is so freeing. Like it's so mind-blowingly freeing, because everything just kind of like washes away. So you know what I mean? Like all the things that we think we got to do, or like I don't know, like COVID lockdowns, what's the timelines, like all that kind of stuff. It's just not even nothing is even really considered, you know from that vantage point. Because in my experience, yeah, like it becomes this, like I was telling you, like kind of like paralysis of this, like it's not a blown out blissfulness. It's just like a subtle like love, peace, bliss that remains.
So yeah, totally, I love it. But so I feel like my experience of this thing, right? Like when I hear you say things, and when we're conversing over text or whatever, sometimes you'll say things like, funny things, like you're just like in a bliss coma or something. And naturally, as a partial human at least, I compare your experience to what I believe mine is. And I start to feel like, you know, there's got to be some way to deepen into my whatever you want to call it, awareness of self. Or and when I start trying to do that, it's kind of like just this strange territory. And I what prevents someone from experiencing that? Because when you're taking away like subject and object and person, really, what is the fuel source to arrive at that destination? Like, is it just like a will to know the truth? Is it surrender? Is it grace? Like, what prevents somebody from realizing that? And, I guess there's a bunch of things you could talk about. Like, there's a dude here that's really big on trauma work and everything, or things that reinforce the individualized identity. But even if you're just talking to me, like, what am I to do to attempt to deepen into this?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, you mentioned three things like will, I think you said will, surrender, and grace.
Great.
And to be honest, those three things are like all very key and very clear, because it's like, okay, the will is the energy or that movement to continue practicing, to continue like deepening in knowledge and wisdom, to continue like upholding righteousness and like the golden rule and like and all the things that kind of like got you to where you are. It doesn't mean like you may always go back to those specific things, but like that energy doesn't like stop, right? I feel like it kind of does and it doesn't. I was having a conversation with Frank, being like Frank Yang. I don't know. I think I've told you about him, or he was on Instagram, and he was claiming he had come to and arrived at the arhat, or the absolute state in Buddhism, from the Buddhist path. And when we were conversing, I was telling him this initial phase that he's been in after the 6-9 months after. I was telling him that was kind of like what I felt like was the honeymoon, because after Rasa and LLC 1000, whatever, I felt like there was a huge honeymoon where I was like, yeah, I'm done. Like, there's nothing I need to do, So there was that kind of, and I don't know how your experience was. That I forget how it was for you, but it was like, yeah, like I stopped reading, I stopped practicing, I stopped doing any meditation. Like all that kind of stopped, and it still continued. Like the realization didn't stop. Like it was just there, and it was so clear, so plain as day. But then at the same time, like, I mean, you were with me for that time. Like I wasn't always like the nicest fellow, let's say, or like we built up that center, and I felt like I made like potential mistakes or things that weren't always aligned in that regard. Maybe like from a perspective of the human design, when I look at human design, there was many aspects that I wasn't fully living, or I hadn't understood about my design and how to live in alignment. Obviously I went through the fasting process, in that period, like there was so many different like, kind of components to that. Relationship with you actually was like a huge heart opener, because I learned so much about like the gentleness and the softness and that aspect of myself that I knew, was there, but it was very like wounded or blocked or, whatever. The celibacy movement of sexual energy and, partners in that period of heart opening, and the female presence, which also like, contributed to that, which I think just overall is a theme of relationships, I think is probably one of the biggest topics with the trauma work, like post awakening, right? Because I know for me, and I'm sure you too, it's like that one was probably where like so much of the progress came. Because really, when I'm speaking to this like paralysis of love bliss, where I experience it is like usually directly in my heart, and I'll go into this in a minute, like just the various points, but mainly the heart, and mainly like a deep compassion for everyone and every living being. Like that's how I experience it. So I didn't have that as much before. I knew I had it like early in my life, like maybe pre like 10 years old. Like I remember I used to watch movies that just cry because I could feel their pain and shit like that, but I didn't have that from like 10 to like almost like 28, 29. Like it was just slowly starting to like come back, right? So that I felt like, I mean, with Rasa, they talk about the brakes are off. So like that process maybe is just part of the integration naturally. But at the same time, like I've spoken to this, how I haven't always seen that happen for all other enlightened beings. I don't, I don't always see that heart integration occur. And that's why you get people like Genghis Khan or like, you know, just other gurus that go into like weird kind of things or tangents, right? Because it's like that heart integration didn't happen. So that's a really interesting thing. I guess you'd have to ask them too, because it's like a product of karma, product of you know, trauma work. But to be honest, like probably one of the more transformative components to all this was like the diving into like the KS work and like really getting into like all the different activations and learning that knowledge. Because, you know, like to me, I feel like that's one of the core missing pieces with a lot of the other like traditional Nondual or other awakening paths, right? Not to say that they're, you know, incomplete, but you know, um, so that's there. But one thing that too, like I'll just cover too, and we can go into other things. But I've been writing about this a lot because I've been going through the series of these activations in myself that KS has been important in trying to like understand, but it does come from more the traditional Taoist perspective, because in the Taoist tradition they have lower dantian, middle dantian, upper dantian, right? So that does relate kind of the chakras. And then even when you look at the KS work, those 3 points do relate to like a bunch of other points, especially in the lower region. There's like a bunch of points like the Da A center, the raw center, the tailbone, you know, like the seed atom in the tailbone. So there's a bunch of like different points there. You know, then you have the Carinata seal, heart chakra, Azure, you know, like there's a kind of like an amalgamation of points here. And then you have the brain centers and like the multiple other chakras that, you know, most 7 chakra systems don't talk about. So that's where I'm like, I'm not 100% sure like what's always being activated. Like recently I've been asking myself like, okay, like, is this the Dansien or is this something else like from a Keylontic Science reference that I don't really even know is there, kind of thing, right? So that's another topic. But if we were to just use like 3 Dansiens, because that is a traditional like topic, I felt the progressive activation of these 3 main regions over the course of like post like absolute awakening, whatever, where they didn't all happen in the same sequence, but like the heart was definitely like the main one, and that one opened that kind of like deep compassion and that love. So like I said, relationships was probably the biggest one that was there, like all the healing in relationships, just like acting with more integrity, like more compassion, more understanding, like as a practice, you know, like literally like reflecting, okay, like am I being understanding with this person, you know, like am I like that type of like active, you know what I mean? So that is a direct like this is what can be done kind of thing, you know. So that's there. Then the gut in the lower dantian, that felt that I told you I think about this before, but that's felt like the ecstatic ball kind of thing, right? And I thought it was because of the fasting and clearing at the digestive system, and I definitely think that's like a key part of it. But it's definitely like a mix of that, and also like the sexual energy element, you know, like being celibate for almost a year, not necessarily just because being celibate, but like the semen retention and like being able to move the energy. I felt like that was like a key component to activating that. But that I feel way more often. And even if I eat, because before I'm like, oh, if I eat it's gonna go away, because and then it would, because I was like kind of like feeding into that. But I realize now, like even if I eat, it'll still be there. It just may be a little dimmer, but it'll still be pretty strong. And then past few months, I've been really focused on like the head center, because I'm like, okay, say I have like an orgasm, or I think of like psychedelic experiences of the past. The brain was generally the one that was the most like pleasureful, and I had like the full brain activation, you know, where like I felt like I'd have like a halo around my head, and I could like, you know, compute shit like in Limitless, or you know, those types of experiences from back in the day. But I hadn't had that like as much like over the past few years, at least to the same, like I wouldn't say like need to have that in the same intensity, but like a consistent feeling of like clarity and blissfulness in the head. So that's been more of the focus, and it's been happening a lot more. So I've been feeling that, where like there's been an openness and clarity. And that could be something as simple as like not going on social media too much, or like not being around like 5G shit, or you know, just being very cognizant of my thoughts and like any energy I'm putting into certain things, and like catching it before I go down too far, like down a rabbit hole or something like that, you know, which could relate to open head centers of human design and different things. But those 3, like focusing on those 3 energies with those like those types of practices for each have been pretty like important, to feeling that consistent like movement of of blissfulness, And the other thing too, I would say that I've just it's like I get reminded of this all the time, and I feel like you can 100% relate to this, or maybe like 99, I don't know. But is music, like devotional, like music, and like frequency of like just sounds, and like to me, like that's probably one of the quickest ways I get back into the kind of heart bliss or heart peace kind of space, right? Where like if I feel like something's like just like my energy is getting a bit off on something. I don't know. Maybe I'm sitting too long, or like my body's getting weird, or I just got a headache or something like that. If I go to the music, I find the music is probably one of the quickest things that brings me back to that. And also conversations. Like it's more just like the higher movement of that creative energy, right? So those are some initial things, but like just thinking about it now, a lot of the semen retention elements has to be coupled with like the movement of the energy in some form. So like intimacy of conversations and like connecting with people, or like music. For me, it's like writing, just sitting and writing. But the movement of the energy is really important, because there's so much of it now. Like there always was a lot of it, but now it's like it's so much more than ever before. So it's like it's almost like if it, even just like a few minutes, or like say like 20-30 minutes of like kind of getting stagnant, it's felt like way more, because it's like, well, there's so much energy to move, so yeah, so there's a lot of things, but that's kind of like some of the things that have been percolating over the past like year especially,
Wow.
yeah.
So just collect all of that for a sec.
Yeah.
There's a couple things that you touched on. Just off, not in any like chronological order, but one thing I noticed about Rasa for sure is I remember thinking to myself, like after it was done, like I didn't know that there was even the potentiality to feel that good in my heart until after Rasa was done. Like, and that's still, I always say like, there's kind of just like this like trigger switch in my consciousness where I can just choose to like put my consciousness in my heart, and there's not even necessarily any like direct qualities or thoughts associated with getting there. It's just like a sinking my thinking mind into my heart. And obviously like it's compassion and those things, but I'm not even like thinking about that. It's just like all kind of thoughts that or feelings that aren't of like that kind of just peaceful contentment just go away, and then I feel like a nice little bliss, but it's pretty localized in my heart region.
Yeah.
um
Me too.
I haven't felt too much like I'd say like the head center is next in line for like the most activity, and even that's kind of sparse sometimes, it just
Mm-hmm.
activates and happens. But lower Tien, I normally, I don't know, I don't feel a lot of bliss in my lower Tien, and I've been thinking about that on and off for a while, just because I mean, me, I do have my creative practices, so I thought I would have nailed it by now, but
Yeah.
anyways, that's not even really what I want to go into. What I wanted to go into is kind of reel it back, because I wanted to kind of stay at least somewhat focused on like this whole concept of the absolute and how it can be like integrated and related to all the other aspects of life. And so in your last kind of uh, moments of speaking there, you touched on a lot of things, a lot of like experiences and phenomena, right? And so like I don't know, there's no subject or there's no object, and you're kind of doing your best to rest in this place. And I mean, you're still a human being, and I guess that's why we reference things like human design, because you still have to make decisions, and phenomena and experience doesn't stop. So you're still experiencing as a human being, and you have decisions you can make, and things you want to invest your energy to, and those types of things. And I guess specifically, we'll just start with like the whole KS thing, and how you feel that all relates, because I've noticed a lot of confusion in my mind lately about it all. And I guess this is something that you'll probably be able to touch on too. A lot of people around me are obviously using psychedelics, and I'm being invited to ceremonies relatively often. And I've also, just to kind of be like balanced with it, I've noticed like, yeah, I've actually received quite a bit of conditioning that this is bad, and that's been affecting me equally as much as like thinking it was good. Like just through KS and through spending my time with you, I took on this imprint that like these things are like demonic wastes of time, essentially, which I don't authentically feel like is the direct truth. Although I can definitely see where there's a lot of room for just like an indirect path, or distracting by all of the crazy phenomena that's going on. But Rupert was talking about how, yeah, if this guy was asking him if he should do LSD, and Rupert was pretty much like, well, you can do it if you want. It won't bring you closer to yourself, is something that he said, but you'll be able to experience a broader spectrum of the mind.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I thought that was interesting, because a lot of people claim, that these medicines or whatever, they put you in touch with yourself. And then also what I've noticed is kind of in line with the whole KS thing is like when I step into a teepee or whatever, and like last time I did peyote or whatever, it's like stepping into like this incredibly vast mystery school while you're extremely like high and you have a limited time in there. Nobody's like talking about like the potentialities of what your consciousness can do, because there's, some of the people you're doing it with, they could, really, they don't really know what even, they're just doing the ceremony like the tradition taught them. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like the psychedelics and then the KS and multidimensional abilities and things that you can attain, abilities or cities that you can attain, and how that relates, and how maybe you work with that kind of process internally about having this eternal state that you've always been, where there's not really necessarily any seeking or effort at a certain point. It's just kind of like this dissolution. And then also like attaining things from the perspective of you being this individualized consciousness that can invest your energy in certain areas of your being, and activate certain things. Like, how does that all work in your mind?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of stuff there. Good stuff. I mean, well, going back to like something you reflect on and right after I shared, which was like the heart space, and just like returning to that kind of, I guess what got us there, like that the clarity of the non-dual self inquiry, or heart focused kind of who am I type of meditation. That to me is really like the fundamental core, which I really always come back to, because even when we're looking at like Keylontic Science or something like that, um, it's like, yeah, there's all these different methods, all these different techniques, and sometimes it can be confusing which one to work with or not. But even in those teachings, like whether some advanced students or Yesha or whoever, you know they've talked about like how at a certain stage that all kind of changes, right? Where you remember the fact of your that you are this eternal energy, and you're structured in many different forms, but you are this entire energetic template. So to need one particular like meditation or technique or that, like this is where it really becomes more of like a dance, like more of like an art, where there is no real specific technique that you have to use particularly, because not that you transcended it, because you definitely can use these different techniques, but it's like the intelligence of source is now taken over, right? So that's kind of how I experience self-inquiry now, where like the moment I go into that, like I'm given like exactly what I'm needed in that moment. Like I'll have like a very quick, like very even just subtle, maybe like epiphany or something to explore, or it's just drop everything, like there's nothing you need to focus on right now, just drop into yourself. And as I do that, like exactly like you're saying, like the heart just expands, and it's not really like bliss is an interesting term because a lot of people use bliss and then it's like this constant seeking of bliss, you know? And I think that's kind of the energy behind like the psychedelic movement, is like there's something potentially not so okay here. So then the psychedelics is like that promise, just like a meditation could be just like a breathwork ceremony, just like anything. It's like something to like make this better. But when you come to that like self-inquiry space, to me, like there's sometimes maybe like a gateway of like a couple minutes or something where I'm like, yeah, like I'm not feeling so great, or like, you know, I have a headache, or you know,
Yeah.
whatever. But like as soon as you like pop through that window, it's like back to everything is just perfect as can be, you know, or whatever whatever I'm needing, or whatever I'm having to learn, or whatever is now the present topic of my current experience. Um, that's just revealed, you know, like that's brought like right to the surface. And it's so quick, like processing. I was having this discussion with someone recently, you know, like because you know, like that method that I've taught for years now of like energy healing and like looking at the thing, whatever, it's just like a glorified self-inquiry technique technically, but it's just like a laser surgery on particular subjects. But technically, like that's always what I come back to all the time. I do that every day because there's always kind of
Yeah.
something, you know, like that may arise, whether it's really subtle or whether it's something more challenging or whatever. Like that's all just still kind of like there. It's just that um it processes so quickly. Like there's nothing to even really like say about things. Like nothing is dramatic, you know. It's not like this long thing I gotta like talk about, and you know, it's just kind of whatever, right? um so I think that's the key. It's like the speed of everything is so much faster. So the way I look at like manifestation of any particular thing, you know, whether it's like you're saying like a city, or um you know, like a, I don't know, relationship or money or like whatever, it's just simply a product of focus. Like that's all it is. Because if you are now remembering yourself as source, so everything you focus on, or everything your individual will moves into, is moving backed by source, you know what I mean? Like it's moving with the power of source. um then it's really just a product of focus. It's not that like you're going to instantly manifest, because we're not at that stage yet. And although like it does feel sometimes instant, like especially sometimes like things that don't require so much like physical building or whatever, like um I really am seeing like the speed element. It very much is like almost instantaneous. But then like with that comes like the responsibility, right, of like where is your focus. And that's where I've been like just catching myself recently, you know, like even just like the inputs of social media or just other people's like opinions and shit like that. It's like you see how much that can affect you, because if you don't have like a clear grasp on your focus, then all that stuff you're taking in, and you're kind of subconsciously like putting energy into those focuses, and it's manifesting you, and you may not even know like how powerful you really are in that sense, right? So I feel like that's really something like, okay, coming to the absolute knowing of that of yourself is like essentially step one, really. But it's like, okay, you come to that, and then you realize, well, yeah, anything I focus on I can manifest. It's like infinite possibilities, right? um and so then I guess what happens with that is like, and I think this is where like the chaos piece comes in, is if you focus on something and you're seeing like there's still some challenge there to manifest, not necessarily you're feeling much challenge, but it's like it's not instantaneous, it's not just happening out of the blue. Well, there's could be different layers to why that is, you know. And I think that's where the Keylontic Science System brings a whole new paradigm of perspective of how vast we really are. Like how vast is our energy body, and all the different distortions we've taken in over the many years, and how those things may still very much require like certain focus and time to take care of and deepen into and deal with, right? That may not always be covered in the typical like non-dual absolute, you know, type of kind of enlightenment concepts. Because like we've talked about a bit, it's like LOC 1000, absolute enlightenment. um it's I don't see that as the end. I don't like, it's not the end at all. Like it's a new beginning, but I think it's a new beginning of some like whole new ball game, like a whole new level of exploration, right? And so like, you know, when you look at the psychedelics and stuff, it's like, yeah, sure, I mean, I guess on some level there could be like benefit, or there could be you know there could be something like that that kind of still manifests as healing or further integration or something from with those tools. At the same time though, like I still I personally am aren't am not interested, just because like I continue to see like the power of the things that I can do just with myself and and my body, and what I have accessible. And that's what everything has always pointed me to, whether it was like the fasting or the urine therapy, or the tantric, like the sexual work, and like the semen retention, celibacy. you know um the KS work is all, I mean, of course it's stuff that's been gifted to us, and there's techniques and methods that I wouldn't really know if I didn't have it, but it's still just like my own faculties that I'm kind of using, right? So I do feel like it's actually it seems like the slower path, but it's not, because in the end, whatever that means, you're building up the frequency in such a way, that strengthens you for the long term, that's all you, like, essentially. But the funny thing is, I guess, from the non-dual, like typical non-dual perspective, is everything is you anyway. So when you're using the LSD or the psychedelic or whatever, then yeah, very much so, it is like, if you see it as yourself, then how could it really like do you harm in the ways that maybe is described, from potentially like a more fear-based stance, like whether that's in the KS community or in other works, right? um but yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I don't have a black or white perspective on it as much. I think it's like something that has to be explored, right? Like with for each of us. I do put my kind of trust in what I continue to be revealed, like through my own experience already, but like through a lot of these like various teachings, the KS stuff, or some of my past teachers that usually pointed away from it. And I saw why the hard way, like in my own journey. And as much as it was at a different stage, it could certainly be different now. Like if I went back and explored, um, but yeah, I mean, it's a vast kind of space. But coming back to like the core of the question, like, or the just topic, which was like, yeah, what are we doing when we're manifesting things or cities or whatever? I just see it as a product of focus. Like for me now, it's like that's I guess what the trust keeps coming back to, is like, just because I'm in the space doesn't mean like I have full awareness of exactly how my life's gonna play out, and like, you know what I mean, like all the abilities to like deal with anything and like all that shit. Like that's not necessarily the case. However, it is, in the sense that if you are in trust that everything now from this space is God, then everything that you need is going to be revealing itself in the correct timing. So it's more of a product of just really like deep listening, and like hearing like what is reality, or the what is the reflection revealing to you about your focus. That's probably the best way to put it. Like what's being presented revealing about what I'm focusing on, you know and that I feel like is what's like clear as day, like more than ever right now, right?
Wow. Yeah, that's a nice little contemplation there. I
Yeah.
mean, it seems like a natural part of anyone's mind when you start catching wind that there's no one else around. It's just you're always kind of just looking at things from different angles. And I mean, yeah. So like in my household, I have these well, one of them just left to Costa Rica. So now there's just another person here. It's just me and him. I just met him recently. He was a friend of the person I was staying with. And not to get into anything like whatever, but I noticed these qualities in these people, like just very you know, I'm around a lot of like real space cadet kind of people, and not even a derogatory way or anything. Like obviously they're maintaining their physical life, they're grounded to whatever degree. And recently I've really started to like question, like, why am I around all these people? Like, why am I attracting these people that when I'm in their presence, I have such a feeling of like, I'm like, I feel a little bit obtuse in my mind. Like, am I, um, am I so kind of ignorant to some of the magic that's accessible within my being that I'm like attracting all of these very strange and very almost like flamboyant and downright hilarious at that time reflections of like, channelers and people just like feeling so, I don't know if it's authentic, but like they go through these intense waves of excitement and and importance and activation, and everybody's like, there's always an activation every day. It's like literally my roommate, her name's Robin, and she would like come into my room like every day and be like, Jack, everything's different now. I'm totally a new person. And like it's because of this gene key and the seven sacred seals, and they'd have the reasons or whatever. But ultimately in like integrity of myself, I'm wondering like, why am I attracting this? And then maybe coupled with this kind of experience of being around these people, like sometimes sometimes I do have like very piercing and sharp clarity, and it kind of aligns with a lot of the things you said about focus. And yeah, I had a moment recently where I kind of just caught wind of, it was when Miracle left, and so I've been on my own in Hawaii, and I was thinking about all of the connections and the reflections at large of the community, and there's this movement towards sovereignty and the times we're in, and my involvement in cryptocurrency. And I'm like, okay, like I see what I'm doing, like, I understand what I'm cultivating here. um, and maybe that is a good reminder to like just reflect on the focus piece, because there's been a whole bunch of waves since those moments. But when I said earlier, like I sometimes feel like my mind is obtuse, like when I think about this whole non-dual thing sometimes, and I start to rest in that place, it's almost embarrassing to say in a way, but I just feel like completely inundated in even being a human sometimes. And it comes and goes. Like sometimes it is much easier and making decisions is natural and simple. But like I do find my mind in like in this place sometimes where it's like, well, like what do I how what like am I just supposed to like, I kind of go through this purposeless phase and this meaningless, and like every action that I do is inherently meaningless, although it has some relative purpose. But um and this is, I guess, turning into a bit of a rant, but you know uh,
Definitely relevant though. I feel like it's funny coming after the psychedelic question, because it's like when I look at my phase of psychedelics, that's what my life was. I remember it. Like I remember it so clearly, like with my old, with Raina and then my old, business partner and friend Mike, and it was kind of like this like never-ending movie scene, where like where like everything felt just like the next scene in the movie, and people would think like, oh, that's like sounds so great, and it does, but it's like an addiction, right? Because it has to keep going, so there has to always be like the next best thing, right? So it was kind of like, I remember it like it would almost be like every time like Mike came home, or like every time I come home, it'd be the next story, like, oh, guess what, like you know what I mean?
and it builds up, right? It just gets more layered. And
Just all the time. It just never ended, right? So, and then when I stopped using, I would slowly start to fall off the wagon, so called, I would slowly start to fall off the wagon, and I would feel myself just falling into this like pit of like despair and anxiety, and I'd start waking up and I wouldn't want to wake up in the morning. I would want to just keep dreaming, or I'd be in my bed filled with, like, it was so bad because my body was so overwhelmed from all that energy, couldn't handle it, right? And it was so drained. So I would go through like this period of like just depression for like 3 6 months, whatever. And then I would go back, and the first hit, I would take like one hit or something, marijuana or whatever, and then it was literally like, yeah, you go back into this thread You know what I mean? Like this thread where everything is interconnected, and you see everything. It's like the high consciousness, right? And it's so blissful and all that. So I'm like, oh, I'm back. and then that would go, and then that would go for like months on end, and it would same thing would happen, and that went on for years before it ended, right? Um and I know exactly what you're talking about when it comes to that. Uh and so like when I look at my experience now and how like deeply consistent and fulfilling it's been, not to say it's not without like those moments you're talking about, you know, where it's like kind of just like, yeah, what the hell, like how do I even deal with like something right now, or not. I'm usually not lost at how to deal with something. It's more like um yeah, like there is actual silence in the mind, or the heart is like filled, or you know, like, or there, it's just so clear, but there's no like clear like epic action. And I think that's part of the healing I'm still going through, is like le- I was saying this recently to someone, like my outer life could look like any normal person. Like there's nothing about my outer life that really is that spectacular at all. Like most people look at my life like, what, like he sleeps on the floor, you know, doesn't eat, or like, you know, like it's just so, I find it so like just mundane compared to like previous times in my experience running businesses, like doing all the shit, whatever. Um, but inwardly it's just like a whole, you like, it's endless, it's eternal, like there's no end to what's going on, even though inwardly I still have like normal human thoughts or whatever, obviously. But again, it's just a product of focus. If I want to focus on like traveling somewhere, or going into my consciousness, or trying to like piece together, I don't know, past life stuff, or whatever is interesting to me at any one point in time, that can be done, right? So it's so interesting, like that paradigm shift, because outwardly there's nothing like, I'm not as much going for this like epic, like I gotta, like, you know, all these epic things are happening all the time, and like, you know what I mean, it's not that, but it's way more than it's ever been, like in regards to like activations, or you know, whatever. It's just not, it's not seen in the same way. It's not like this dramatic big thing, because it's happening all the time, right? And like, I don't know, anytime I've looked at anyone who I've viewed as masterful at something, they didn't really see anything about their mastery, you know, like it's not like they're out there like, oh, like thinking their mastery is a big deal, because they've spent so much time mastering it that it's like second nature. It's like walking or something, you know. So that's where I feel like the real like telltale sign in where we're at on the path is like, do we see ourselves as a big deal? You know what I mean? Or like the happenings in our life as a big deal. Like all that stuff seems so minuscule when you actually like taste, yeah, whether it's like absolute, or the like the eternal self. Because you know, it's kind of like the example I gave about, you know, like Christina or whatever, talk about like 800,000 years ago on Mars or something like this. And then all of a sudden, like all your hopes and dreams and fears about the next like couple of years is just like dismantled in an instant because you're like, oh yeah, it's so minuscule. Not that you don't live it out and don't live it out purposefully, but it's not, it's just not, it's like, you know. So yeah, so I mean, it obviously doesn't answer the question about why you attract those people, but like that's kind of like from my experience, you know, of like, um, yeah, like that's like kind of where it's been, right? And I kind of I had to move through that phase too, like in my reflections, where like I was around, you know, those people. I think actually at the start of the Awaken Center was kind of like that. There was some people around that were kind of in that kind of like scenario. Um, and you know, it comes and goes, but I don't deal with it as much anymore, mainly because I don't, it's like, it's just, yeah, I'm just like, wow, like that's it's a lot. I wouldn't be able to to deal with a living scenario with, you know, that type of energy too much. But I see it often. You see it on social media everywhere. It's such a theme, you know what I mean? Like people have these,
Yeah.
it's that kind of, it's not just psychedelic culture, it's everywhere in the spiritual scene, because it is bliss chasing. And you know, Christina talked about this recently, where she was like just reading encryption, and she was talking about the difference between like peace, like a bliss, like chasing bliss versus just like a real like consistent peace. And I definitely started to notice that difference, you know, a couple of years ago, and more recently it's been way more clear, because that bliss chasing kind of continues to push the pendulum all the time, right? So you're bound to have the lows, because there's still kind of like a needing to have the kind of, you know. So I was actually exploring this the past couple days. It was just like coming to me again about, you know, just the topic of like devotion, and like how we treat, uh, if everything is God, everything is the source or the absolute, then how we treat everything is a reflection of how much we really know that. You know what I mean? Like if everything is God, everything is the source, then how you treat every moment or everything or every being, um like what would that look like? You know what I mean? Like treating it like compassionately and gently, like with deep humility and respect, and I don't know, a calmness or an understanding. It's like there's so many elements there of like how would you show up to meet, you know, the absolute source of all. Like if it was in, you know, say a human being form or something, I don't know, that's usually the most like graspable experience. But from that lens, it kind of like, it's just everything shifts, because the way that you're showing up to meet the absolute in all your moments, like you would always want to be like tip top, like on point, you know, like in a very like uh deep devotional type of way. And I feel like that, like just holding that type of, it's not like holding that intention all the time, but that reminder, oh man, that like continue, that brings like endless healing. I don't think there's ever an end, to be honest, in that, like with that type of like contemplation, because you're just constantly like refining yourself, you know, refining how you're living, how you're engaging, how you're experiencing, like in every way. And then the reflection also does the same, like it presents that, you know, back to us or whatever. So that's I guess the most practical thing I could say to like post absolute like awakening or realization or whatever. And that's kind of how I've been bridging the gaps with the KS world, because you know KS doesn't use absolute lingo. Their idea of like final enlightenment, there's no such thing as final enlightenment, really. Like they talk about like, you know, Adashi return, and you know, these types of like full Christ star, like full Christ star, Adashi return, awakenings, that kind of thing, and like returning back and, you know, going through the cycles again or whatever. I guess that could be pretty close, but it's not the way that it's described in the more Advaita non-dual world. Far more complex, but same principles, I guess. Um, but the most fundamental, to be honest, like as much as everyone talks about all these techniques and whether you do plasmas or this or the new teachings, old teachings, you know, like all the, it really does come back to like the, you know, attitudes of mastery, responsibilities, the shield of Kale, which is like that shield that has like, you know, all the virtues, right? The all the virtues, and like each of the descriptions of those virtues. Like you could literally just meditate on each of them for a lifetime, and I don't even think you'd, you know, be able to master all of them, because they're so deep, all of those, like to really understand all those different principles and like live them in every way. So that to me, like that's what's really practical, like what I've been coming back to a lot. Like it's kind of like this, it's like an ongoing self audit, right? That's kind of how I see it. And those each relate to like the chakras, because those virtues are encoded within the chakras. So if you have imbalances with the chakras in any way, um, which can which can be the case for someone who's absolutely awakened, like from typical non-dual, that would just be their process of post-integration, like you and I are going through, you know. That's how I see it, right? So if there's like imbalance in higher chakras or low chakras or middle, like whatever, like that's just going to make itself known like way more profoundly, um, from this post kind of awakened lens. And then how someone deals with that or wants to integrate with that, you know, that could be that's a whole other can of worms technically, right? But essentially it would happen way faster in my view, because well, you're the source now. So you've always been it, but now you see it. So now then the healing can just happen, like miracle healing almost, you know, at times, I guess, in combination with, KS technologies or whatever other tools you're using. But yeah, that's an interesting topic to me, you know, and the trauma stuff and all that, because because again, that's where I see the Keylontic Science stuff to be very important, because it brings a level of depth or a level of understanding of the healing process that nothing else I've seen covers, right? And it's the reason why you could have an absolute being who could still be like a Genghis Khan or something like that, you know? So that's kind of where we're at. But I think, you know, that's kind of like common lingo in the new age, like the embodiment, the awakening of the feminine, you know, it's like recognizing like the physical form has to be healed too. Right. So it's kind of, it's all, it's all important. It's all together. But yeah, I know. That was funny though. The space cadets. Oh man. I still see it in myself in small tendencies, you know, like talking to people, like friends once in a while. It's not often, but sometimes I'll see it and I'm like, oh yeah, that's not it. You know, I find like the conspiracy world is very much like that too. It's just another form.
Right.
And that's why they're very much intertwined. I find like the psychedelic worlds, conspiracy worlds, all that. It's like anytime I find myself in that conspiracy type mode, it just doesn't. Nothing about it feels right. Nothing about it at all. Because I'm like, what am I even saying here? Like, who am I trying to convince of anything right now? You know what I mean? Like, it's just like this like energy, or like it's addictive, right? It's that same kind of like addictive, you know, kind of pattern or whatever, right? So
trying to encourage critical thinking. Like, hey, did you know? Did you ever consider this?
totally. Well, the funny thing is like when I refer to the conspiracy vibe, like it's a particular vibe. Like if I'm speaking to like true histories, or, you know, like, I don't know, certain race lines or whatever, like I feel like I can speak about it in a way that's like it's like a history lesson more so, you know, it's like a descriptive like conversation, versus when you get into that kind of mode where you're just trying to like fuel the fire with something, you know,
It's
and
sensationalized.
yeah, you know, or you see something on social media and it sparks something, but you didn't actually go and look into it a little bit, you know, to see like what's actually happening there. So yeah, that's a kind of that's interesting. And then again, like that relates to like the synchronicity. You see a synchronicity, you immediately draw a connection, you think, oh, that's it. But then like if you rest in it for a little longer, like maybe that's not exactly it. You know what I mean? So it's just, it's something to always be like cognizant of, I guess. But it's a funny space to be. And even right now, you know, like you're saying, like we were both talking about like places to go, or, you know, how do we set ourselves up in this next little while? Like that's all. I think it's all just relevant, practical conversations. But as soon as it like turns into something, you know, like it's this topic, that's where instantly I'm like becoming way quicker at catching those little trends, you know.
Like as soon as, like, say you're contemplating going to this place, and then there's like this like great story behind it, like, you mean I'm gonna go there and, like, you know, there's all this epic shit I can do, or I'll be recognized, or what do you mean?
Yeah, it's more, I mean, it's really just typical like open head center stuff, you know. Like the mind starts getting like really like wanting to know the unknown, wanting to have certainty, you know, asking a lot of questions about it, really considering, justifying, rationalizing a bunch of different like options, you know, all that. I'm like, oh, what is that even? What is that doing? When has that ever worked? When has it ever brought any more clarity? It hasn't. And And it's a big ride. I mean, to be honest, like I was considering this the other day. I'm like, pretty much the large portion of what I've done in my life that's had any sort of like significance, or what I thought was significant, was in many ways fueled by not self behavior, or conditioning, you know? So like to live, or to start living, or to continue to live in a way where you're living from a place of healing, a place of clarity, a place where not letting those, like from human design, the centers really influence all that shit. That's like a whole new territory, you know what I mean? Like in some form, I'm recognizing it's been happening for a few years now, but it does still feel new on some level, like, and unknown, and like so simple, to be honest, like actually so ridiculously simple, that the tendency of the open head, open ajna, you know, or the open sacral for me, like those energies of like really going into things, um to then be the guide or the leader in decision making. It's like, oh boy, like that's, it's not it. It's just not it, you know? So so yeah, I have found that to be like a particular area of potential challenge recently in the kind of dynamics of, yeah, like where to go, or where to, you know, but it always comes back to like just being where I am, you know what I mean? And like coming back to that self-inquiry process and all that, because not like always running to meditation, although that is a tendency at times, but more so just like, okay, when I'm in that space, and as I'm in that space, everything is clear and there isn't a feeling of urgency or whatever. There's a clarity that something is happening. There's definitely a move occurring, or like there's shifts that are guiding in new directions, but not like jumping ahead of the gun, you know, like, or ahead of the whatever, jumping ahead in steps, or in that regard. That's how I'm seeing it more, you know, and obviously, and also just not making it more complex than it needs to be. Like it could be as simple as just like going to camp in the forest for a week and just feeling that out, you know, like that's it. Like nothing else, you know what I mean?
That's nice.
Yeah, because I don't know, even in regards to the dynamic of like Canada right now, you know, everyone's freaking out about Canada, and like everyone's wanting to leave and like all that shit, and I'm like resting in this middle place. I'm like, okay, well, I have no real issue with travel or leaving or going any place. Personally, I don't actually love traveling like crazy, so that's just me. But I'm not like I'm not denying the energy of like going to, you say, Costa Rica, or you know, someplace not in Canada. But at the same time, I'm also like, if this is being driven by, you know, like fear of lockdowns and what's gonna happen, and like the new world order that's coming to Canada, all that shit, I'm like, that's just not true. Like that's not, that certainly could happen, but that's not the truth in my decision making, you know, like that can't, that's just not gonna fly. It's not gonna work, right? So um so I'm noticing that energy of like, it always comes back to that quote, like wherever you go, there you are, you know? Because when we think of like absolute awakening, our source, essentially what we're saying is like we're stepping outside of time, or stepping outside of like any sort of like clear, like
Anything, yeah.
anything, right? So from that sense, technically what we're speaking to is like infinite possibilities, like quantum reality, right? Like whatever we focus on is what's going to manifest. There's nothing else. Like there's no particular like perfect destiny or perfect exact like thing that has to happen or whatever.
It's like you're removing the object of that cause and effect.
Yeah,
It's like there's no such thing as fate, in a way.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it, you know? So like I still feel, I guess that's kind of like you say, we checked in when we used to check in with Bavik or something, and it would be like, yeah, like it's not going to change much either way, kind of thing, when you would give those types of answers, right? And I feel like that's what I've been coming to in my own way, as I've been not resisting, but like really uprooting that feeling to want to go to someone and like get them to read. Because I'm like, I was reflecting on this, and not that I'm against like readings, but like, because obviously I still explore them past few years, but I was reflecting, I'm like, what can a reading actually give me outside of what I can give myself in my own reading? Because when I have had any sort of form of that recently, or even like using the playing card decks or whatever, all they ever do is just reflect what I already know. Like it's just so clear. Like this is what I'm feeling, and the cards just show me what I'm feeling. So again, the object thing is apparent there, because it's like then there's no external object or God that's coming to deliver me from anything, because there's nothing to be delivered from. It's already known. That's kind of like how I've been seeing it. So today I was reflecting on like, wait a minute, what if like the whole process right now is just to like slow down and get like crystal clear, not on like this is what it needs to look like particularly, but more so like what the energy of how I feel like it is going to feel like, or like how I'm feeling now. And if I'm feeling like this now, then if I want this to be more consistent or just to continue, not to hold to a feeling state, but just like that, absolute kind of heart clarity or whatever, then it would just be to focus on that. Because if I just keep focusing on that, and how that influences or is influenced by my reality in practical ways, like, I don't know, having juices or being around, like people that I can talk to or connect with intimately or whatever, then that's all that really needs to be like focused on. Because from that like vantage point, like all the other clarities of where, when, what, whatever, that's just going to make itself known based on my own focus and my creation, not as some like like you're saying, like some fated destined path. But that's potentially where they merge, because then maybe they're exactly the same. you know like you would think that, like, if you're coming to the absolute state where you're collapsing all those realities, then essentially that's what it is. It's not. So it's literally like being a part of the active participation of that creation, not necessarily in this like manipulative and controlling type of way, but more just like a clarity of focus, and directing the I don't know, river, or like whatever, I guess, like a flow of consciousness, flow of energy. That's that's what was like coming the past day or so, which, like, from a human lens is kind of like could be frightening, because you're like, yeah, then there's nothing to rely on but yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you ultimately have like the power to go and create and do and go in whatever direction. And so yeah, that's what I was like coming to, because I'm like,